I'm just gonna um so yeah, there'll be plenty of time for us to have a discussion. And I'm also very much approaching this material not from the perspective of anyone who's like got any particular expertise in any of it. I'm like very amateur art historian, so very much looking forward to hearing what people, how this material relates to people's own practices, their own lives. Um, and yeah, I'm sure there's lots of people here who have like really interesting takes on the material, and we'll have like stuff that you can bring to the discussion that will kind of like open these forms out. I think one of the really interesting things that I found in kind of looking at these forms, both the caryatids and the atlases, as well as the kind of like Art Nouveau curves, is that these forms kind of like are multivalent, and they open up to lots and lots of readings, lots of counter readings, lots of refutations, lots of contestations. Um, so yeah, I really hope that people will yeah, just see what comes to mind, and feel free to like use this space as a kind of experimental space in looking at these forms and thinking about these things. So I'll just get on and start the presentation. Um, can people see that? Great. And then I'll just start the slideshow. So yeah, I mean, I called this presentation on sadism in the city, but I'd like to initially reflect that I'm not using the term sadism in any particularly precise kind of psychoanalytical sense, or Freudian sense, of which there's particular theories about sadism, about masochism. I'm really just using this term as shorthand for um, yeah, this trend that I've um, been thinking about um, the bourgeoisie and bourgeois art and architecture, especially of the 19th century, in an attempt to think about why the bourgeoisie is drawn to depicting um, its own victory over the proletariat. And I put victory in quotation marks as well, because I think one of the things that, especially with the caryatids and the atlases, is thinking about this notion of like an eternal victory of the bourgeoisie, that the bourgeoisie was drawn to depict in the 19th century, and what are what else can we read into these figures? How these figures are being staged as a kind of like um, with an eternal grasp on the future, and what we might be able to read against that. So yeah, I'm not thinking of sadism in any particularly precise psychoanalytic sense. Having said that, um, I did want to think about. Uh, I was thinking about Pasolini's film. I don't know if people have seen it, um, Sallow or 120 Days of Sodom, which is like a really like a brutal film, and it's not really possible as well to kind of wholeheartedly speak in favor of the film. It's set in fascist Italy in 1941, 42, and it's basically a very repetitive film about um, four fascist men. I think it's a president, a priest. God, I can't even remember what the other two is, but it's kind of like um, these four men, and they ritually abuse children throughout the film. So and it's kind of like it's torture, but it kind of shows um, it kind of so forcefully shows the kind of sadism of the fascist bourgeoisie. And I think also, even though it's set in a specific moment of fascism, there's something about it that feels like an eternal now, or it seems very pertinent to now, and thinking about how the bourgeoisie oppresses children routinely and structurally, was something that I was thinking of in this as well. And there's a quote in that film where one of the characters is almost about to shoot a boy, but then he basically says, "Fool, how did you imagine I could kill you? Don't you know we'd want to kill you 1,000 times to the limit of eternity, if eternity has any?" So again, I was thinking about this word and this kind of concept of eternity as it figures within bourgeois aesthetics of sadism. And then, yeah, I won't kind of go through all of these possible topics of discussion because we won't have time, but just to throw them out there. Surplus was another thing I was thinking about. Um, and then, yeah, some of the other stuff we'll be able to look through, but also um, I was particularly thinking about the relations to statues in the colonial world, both across the imperial metropole, the imperial metropolis in imperial centers across the West, and the kind of colonial statue mania of the colonial world, which Frantz Fanon talks a lot about in, well, not a lot, but it's a recurring theme of Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, which we'll also have a look at. And so I was thinking about this 19th century world of statues, I think is the broader context of the caryatids and the atlases that I think really have, what we saw with Black Lives Matter, with Rhodes Will Fall, with the Coulston statue toppling in Bristol. Um, these are kind of like pertinent questions to bear in mind. And then also, even though these figures are figures of like being oppressed, the caryatids and the atlases, there's also a sense in which some people are appropriating them for suprematist purposes. And in this, we'll also discuss Zionism. Theodor Herzl was frequently likened to an atlas in his time, and Theodor Herzl was the founding father of Zionism. And it also made me think of William Blake's figure of Urizen, who's very much this strained, this figure of burden, of being bound, but he's being bound in a mess of his own creation, as it were. So even though these are figures of like the marginalized, the oppressed, um, they're also, it pertains to other readings as well. And I want to just open up the possibility of reading some of these sculptures as pertaining to fascism, as pertaining to Zionism. Um, and yeah, so I'll just go over into the first slides now. Um, I live in Glasgow, and um, as you can see from these pictures, this is the facade of the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. I don't know if people from Glasgow want to talk about your experience of seeing these, um, because for me, I really didn't notice them in a strange way until I suddenly did. And I think that's also part of what I wanted to explore in this talk. But did have people who visited the Mitchell Library actually noticed these? Because I mean, yeah, as I said, I really didn't. Jenny's shaking her head, which is, yeah, it's quite a strange phenomenon not to notice them. But I think statues and monuments pertain to this unseen, that they're almost part of the unconscious of the city. And they're almost hidden in plain sight, which it feels very different when you're looking at a photo of them from when you're just like rushing into the library to like do some work or something, and you just don't notice them. But these two figures, the atlases, are at the front of the back of the library actually, and just above them, above the entablature, are these four women figures. And again, I just want to throw this out there that gender is another way that these figures are being organized. So it's another tool of, I want to see gender as a tool of like binary oppression of these figures as well, in that you often have Hi, Suleika. You often have um, men, the atlases, and then the women figures are like just around the corner, or so there's this kind of like binary that's being constructed by these figures. And as you can see from the atlases, the men seem to be like really kind of strained, and the caryatids are always traditionally quite weightless. They seem to bear their burden with this kind of like almost like weightless sense of grace, um, whereas the atlases tend to be, they're being punished in quite an explicit way. Um, and they like if you look at these atlases, they're also being racialized, like um, in as much as they're colonized, enslaved figures, that they're also being racialized. So I'm not reading these figures as white in a way. And yeah, the atlases were initially on St Andrew's Halls, which were destroyed in a fire. And the architect was John Mossman. And then they were taken onto the Mitchell Library and they kind of joined with these caryatid figures. But Glasgow has dozens of these figures, um, much higher density than other cities. I went to London recently and tried to look for as many caryatids and atlases I could find there, and I found a similar amount in Glasgow as in London, which I think says a lot about the particular intensity of the class struggle in Glasgow, especially in the kind of like imperialist heyday of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So I've really just I've just put on this presentation like a few figures, but the one on the left, can people see this figure? It's interesting because it's an explicitly proletarianized caryatid. He's wearing the cloth cap. So the caryatids are often situated inside history. They're not kind of nudes. They're not like what's the word? They're not kind of like a historicized classical nude sculptures. They're very much they always pertain to an element in which they're situated within history. And that I'd like to think of as another form of their punishment, is that they're chained to the historical moment, which is invariably to do with bourgeois victory. But as you can see, yeah, this figure, very interesting that he's like explicitly proletarianized. And here again, you have these kind of weightless women, the caryatids of George Square. And again, for people who've like lived in Glasgow or live in Glasgow, have you noticed these figures? These ones are George Square, and yeah, it's very strange. Like um, this theorist Liz Stanley, a historian, was talking about how statues and monuments, especially of the imperial 19th century, direct the gaze in the city, but strangely remain unseen. And that's also potentially why, during these periods in which the city was convulsed or pertaining to a different energy, like with the Black Lives Matter uprisings, suddenly these became visible, I think. And also, this fascist thing of defending our statues. I don't know if people remember that period from the lockdown where it was the explicit kind of it was the explicit thing of the fascists to like defend our statues, and statues were being torn down. And I think part of that is the city being evacuated and suddenly you see it for what it is. And so yeah, um, I'm quite interested in how the urban space of our cities was constructed in the 19th century and how that's been contested. So these are two Glasgow examples. And then here again, the one on the left is, yeah, interesting. It's quite androgynous. Um, this figure is quite sinewy. Um, it's proletarian, right? And then the figure on the right is again ex almost explicitly racialized. My photos actually cut off the feet, but we can just see the straps of these sandals here, which can people see my mouse cursor if I do that? You can see that they're almost like manacles. And when we look at Michelangelo's Atlas sculptures, we'll see that that kind of like this motif is potentially borrowed from Michelangelo. But yeah, this figure on the right is racialized. Do you know what I mean? Um, and then yeah, to go way back, these oh, it's got the wrong. These are not the Mitchell Library atlases and caryatids. These are the Erechtheion caryatids, which are the most famous example of caryatids. Um, this is on the Acropolis in Athens, and the Erechtheion was a temple to Athena. And yes, so much has been said about these sculptures, and they are kind of like they are archetypal. There's no getting around that in later depictions of caryatids and later ways of thinking about the caryatids. They're all in. They've got this kind of like magnificent sculptural. I don't know, maybe sculptors here want to also come in at this point, maybe Grace. Um, sorry to put you on the spot, but I mean just in terms of like the sculpture itself, they've got this kind of like wet look, um, these wet look robes, and they're in contrapposto, which means counterpoise, and it's a very common technique in sculpture of the human form from classical Western antiquity, and especially in the Renaissance, you'll see like Donatello's sculptures are in contrapposto, Michelangelo, and contrapposto basically means that one leg is out and the hips are broken. So there's this dynamism to the way that they stand. Um, but yeah, maybe. As you can see, also a lot of their limbs have been broken off, which is again we'll point, but we'll come back to. And the ones that are currently on the Erechtheion are replicas, and the originals are. So there's six women, and the originals are in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, save one, which, as people probably could guess, is where it's in London in the British Museum. So she's all on her own in the British Museum, um, which is just like also like quite a horrible thing to do to separate her out from her sisters in that kind of way by Lord Elgin. Um, so I can't remember where I was going with all of this now. But I guess these are the archetypal caryatids. They're women who act as columns, who uphold the entablature. And yeah, does anyone want to say anything about these sculptures before we look at their kind of like origin story? Grace.
I mean, and the only thing I'm thinking with that position is that they kind of captured, there's a sense of movement, even though they supposed to be really still and not function as a body really, or not have any relationship to their bodies. But can I ask one question? Um,
Absolutely.
when when did these like atlas and these sculptures start to appear in places like Glasgow? Is there like specific dates that
So yeah, again, it's very much in the 19th century. So I guess there's three kind of periods that we'll be focusing on. There's like classical antiquity, of which these sculptures are a part. Then there's also the Renaissance, where we'll look at how Michelangelo especially deals with some of these themes. And then there's the 19th century where they experienced a mass revival. You know, in Paris, there's something like 500 um, caryatids and atlases across Paris. In Glasgow, I've counted 40. And it's sort of the second half of the 19th century. So they start springing up in the 1860s. And by, the 1910s, by the outbreak of the First World War, they're kind of, it's already finished. Um, which is also why I think of them in relationship to Art Nouveau, because it's the same periodization of the second half of the 19th century until the outbreak of the First World War, by which point they all disappear. So it's that period of like the most intense and accelerated mass proletarianization of peoples, as well as the imperial heyday. Um, so it's the point at which imperialist circuits of accumulation reach their kind of like highest ever point, especially the British, French, and French empires. We'll think about Belgium when we think about Art Nouveau as well. And yeah, Berlin and Vienna, these were all hotspots for caryatids. So they really do like map on to that period of like the Berlin Conference, especially, and the mass kind of like brutal extraction of labor and natural resources and the like colonization of the late 19th century. Um, the in terms of classical antiquity, this is 5th century BC, the the Erection. So that means like 400 and something BC. And um, these are the most famous examples, but I don't think they're the eldest. Um, Anyone else want to come in at this point or with any questions or reflections or yeah, I just think these figures are really, really remarkable somehow. It's interesting what you say as well, Grace, about the question of movement. I think that's also something I'd love to dwell on within this session is like these figures are frozen and yet there's such dynamism and such struggle that there's almost like this kind of like charge by which they might break out. Or that's the tantalizing thing about them is that they might just walk off in a way. You can see it there, something about them. Um, does anyone want to say anything at this point before we discuss the Vitruvius origin story of these caryatids? Okay, I'll just go on to Vitruvius then, who was obviously was like a Roman, and was writing this book on architecture, this treatise on architecture in the first century BC. So, 400 years, half a millennia later than when these caryatids were built, well, were sculpted. Um, but it's very interesting what he does um, with this kind of like origin story of the caryatids. And the one of the things that's interesting about Vitruvius is he was the first writer on architecture, like who formalized what we know. I don't want to say he was the first writer about architecture, but the first writer of this kind of like trope of architectural writing. Um, and within his 10 books on architecture, the caryatids appear on like page 1 or page 2. So these women are right there. I'll just go back to look at them again. They're there in the first kind of like page of official architecture. Um, they're there at the beginning of the Vitruvius's thinking about architecture. And what Vitruvius is doing in this text regarding them is again something that we'll see the bourgeoisie constantly do with these figures, is insert them within history and almost as if they can't pertain to some sort of open future, but that they're trapped um, within a history. And then I guess we'll look at like Peter Weiss and the aesthetics of resistance to see like how we could read them not just through these kind of like historical lenses, but through historical materialism. So Vitruvius uses these women as a way of making a point about knowing your history. So I'll just read what he says. A wide knowledge of history is requisite because among the ornamental parts of an architect's design for a work, there are many the underlying idea of whose employment he should be able to explain to inquirers. For instance, suppose him to set up the marble statues of women in long robes, called caryatids, to take the place of columns, with the mutules and coronas placed directly above their heads. He will give the following explanation to his questioners. Caryae, a state in the Peloponnesus, sided with the Persians, enemies against Greece. Later, the Greeks, having gloriously won their freedom by victory in the war, made common cause and declared war against the people of Caryae. They took the town, killed the men, abandoned the state to desolation, and carried off their wives into slavery, without permitting them, however, to lay aside the long robes and other marks of their rank as married women, so they might be obliged not only to march in the triumph, but also to appear forever as the type of slavery, burdened with the weight of their shame, and so making atonement for their state. So, in other words, Vitruvius provides this origin story for the caryatids, which explicitly frames them as colonized um, labor, and their punishment is to be displayed as spoils. Now, just to say, when I look at these figures, I don't just see that. I don't necessarily buy that line of argument. And I guess when we come back to thinking about Agnes Varda, we'll see that she kind of refutes Vitruvius's claim in her film Les Dites Caryatides from 1984, which is a beautiful short film about the Paris Caryatids. Um, Anyway, so they're spoils, they're colonial spoils, and again, they're racialized because um, they're not Greek. They sided with the Asian enemy of Greece, and I can't remember who said it, but there was this historian who basically made the claim that the whole of Greek culture was set up as a repression of Asia and its own Asianness. So we can potentially see the dynamics of that repression and that regime of um, both an acknowledgement of the kind of like Asianness of Greek culture as well as its keeping it siloed off in these figures. But again, they part of their function, therefore, according to Vitruvius, is to participate in the victory parade of the ruling class and of the historically victorious of the Peloponnesian War. Um, Another thing that's interesting about them is that there would have been processions up through the Acropolis. So you can almost imagine that at some points it would have seemed like these figures, they're in ranks. So they would have almost seemed like they were part of this procession. As the procession moved through them, there would have been a moment where they would have kind of synced up with this victory parade or this procession. So again, you can see that when we think about movement, potentially the fact that they're in this kind of like contrapposto position with one leg forward and the broken hips, it's almost as if they are walking, they are part of the procession, but this would have only been come to life in a moment of like when the procession was going up the Acropolis, you would have been able to almost see them come to life and almost like participate in this procession. Um, and then just to go back to this next page, so yeah, I mean, I was thinking of them like if we do see them as colonial spoils, then I mean, I just think that the Walter Benjamin on the concept of history theses was is really like pertinent to that. So I'll just read that really quickly. Whoever has emerged victorious participates to this day in the triumphal procession in which the present rulers step over those who are lying prostrate. According to traditional practice, the spoils are carried along in the procession. So again, we could see that during the procession up the Acropolis, these women would have been almost paraded as spoils, or that's how they would have synced up to it. They are called cultural treasures, and a historical materialist views them with cautious detachment. For without exception, the cultural treasures he surveys have an origin which he cannot contemplate without horror. And then, we're thinking about these figures as women that were punished for siding with the Persians in the Peloponnesian War. And then later on in this passage, he says, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. And also, barbarism is the method by which they're transmitted from generation to the next. And then he ends this passage with um, the task of the historical materialist is to brush history against the grain. And I think we'll see that with Agnes Varda's reading of the caryatids as well. Um, Before we go on to colonial Algeria, I'll just look at these other examples of atlases from the. So this is around the same time, um, the from the Temple of Zeus in current day Sicily. It's quite an amazing like megalith. The figure on the right, and weirdly, it was just rediscovered last year. So you can see this figure. Can people see my cursor? This figure is like was put up this year or last year or something, and it was just found like this, um, very much in the territory of like Percy Shelley's Ozymandias. This broken monument, this in the with the lone and level sands, um, and interestingly, yeah, we have this sketch by an English illustrator from the 19th century of this figure. Also, this kind of like serene smile. There's something quite beguiling about it. I'll also just draw your attention to these figures at this base. There was a period of like late romantic period in Europe of like really thinking about ruins. So you can see this capital here that's this broken foot, this broken face, but then also this kind of like Medusa-esque. I don't know what's the adjective for Medusa? Medusan f face here, which is again something that we'll come back to presently. Um, but yeah, I just find this illustration quite remarkable somehow. Um, but it's interesting that the only thing that remains of the temple in this illustration is this figure that then later was forgotten and then was um, recently what's the word? Anyway, I also found it quite funny because he looks like the Michelin Man. Do you know what I mean? Um, but anyway, this is a caryatid from elsewhere in so not part of the Erechtheion, not part of the Acropolis, not part of the Temple of Zeus, but another location. I'll have to double check exactly where it is. This is in Cambridge now, so there are two. There are two, as far as I know, in Britain. Um, Caryatid statues from antiquity. One, as I said, is the missing sister who's like been separated from her sisters. It's in the British Museum, stolen, looted. And the second one is in Cambridge. So even these two are like separated. But I just find it interesting. I saw this earlier this year and I just found it interesting that her face is gone. It's like blank, scrubbed out. And yet, if you look at her chest, you'll see this quite impish Gorgon figure. Um, I don't know why she has a Gorgon brooch, like a Medusa. Like, what is it about these sculptures that um, pertains to stasis and turning to stone? Because that's also something that we can think about in relation to Fanon. So I'll just go back a bit. Um, in The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon talks about colonial societies, and he says, a world compartmentalized, Manichaean, and petrified, a world of statues, the statue of the general who led the conquest, the statue of the engineer who built the bridge, a world cocksure of itself, crushing with its stoniness the backbones of those scarred by the whip. This is the colonial world. And I some time ago, I tried to count the instances in which Fanon uses the word petrification, um, which is very frequent in The Wretched of the Earth. So that's something that I've been like thinking through. Um, the statue has a kind of like the colonial statue has a kind of auto-implicatory role. It is itself a manifestation of nothing else than stasis itself, and therefore it sort of imparts a stasis on social relations through the idea that it makes static the world as it is now, the status quo, stasis, status quo. We'll look at the Rebecca Comey thing there, but the function of the statue is to proclaim the eternity of the present, of the status quo. And one of the statues that Fanon alludes to, this is in Algiers, a 19th century bronze statue, of which there are many still in Algiers, of Sergeant Blandon. And Fanon talks about this. I should have actually put the particular quote that Fanon uses, but he's that literally got a bayonet. So he's literally the statue is a warning um, against the colonized, oppressed. That look, this is how we achieved our victory over you with bayonets. I Fanon talks about this in his chapter on violence, and he says that they proclaimed their raw violence and the violence by which they were able to subjugate and dominate and oppress. And it's interesting because you have a simultaneous statue mania across the colonial world, both in the imperial core and in the colonial periphery. But the statues in the imperial core, you don't walk down Whitehall and see Sergeant Montgomery or whatever he's called with a rifle or with a bayonet. So there's a kind of difference, in colonial Algeria you have the raw violence, and then in the West it's occluded and it's kind of hidden a bit. Um, how are we doing for time? Okay, I'm going to actually skip this Rebecca Comey quote just because it's quite long. But she talks about um, the the oscillation in this word histemi, which like statue, state, statute, but also resistance, and that which defies the status quo. So I think there's this kind of dynamic that I'd love to think through a bit. Whoa, time really goes fast, eh? Um, I just wanted to quickly point out this fascist sculptor who's a contemporary sculptor. Here, oh, I thought I had one of him in his studio, but I don't. He makes very kind of classical sculptures, but he cited Schopenhauer as his kind of idol. And what he said is this man, he's called Alexander Stoddard. Sorry, I should have put his name there. He's got a picture of Schopenhauer on his kind of studio door. He's like done half the contemporary statues of the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. And he says, this man here, Schopenhauer, believed that art was there to calm you down, not to stimulate you, but sedate you. Art sedates the ferocity in us. That's why art often gets attacked, because the ferocity in us, excuse me, knows it's being sedated. So, so therefore, it puts up a special resistance to this. That's why it puts traffic cone on a statue's head. He's referring to the famous Glasgow statue of the Duke of Wellington, which has a traffic cone on its head. Um, a desperate attempt to counter the sedative effect. So, I mean, you can see the social role of sculpture and statues, public sculpture and statues pertaining to preventing revolution, as it were. I mean, that is his stated social goal, Alexander Stoddard, is to sedate. He doesn't believe that art has value as something that, creates a Dionysiac frenzy or a revolution or anything like that. Um, what was I saying? Yeah, interesting anyway. And then just these examples of how, you know, almost like illustrating the point he's making about how art gets attacked or how monuments get disfigured or this is the photo on the left is one that I took on the 11th of November 2023, which was the biggest anti-colonial protest that Glasgow's ever seen, um, in terms of like explicitly like Palestinian liberation and against the genocide. And here, you can't even see it, but there's already a figure on this equestrian statue, but the picture almost makes it seem like these young boys were always destined to supersede it and take it over. It's just interesting the way this whole new like image. And then here you have this is my dear friend Bryony who posted this really beautiful um thing about it as well. But this guy Daniel Day who scaled like a lizard the walls of like the clock tower of Big Ben in London. Weirdly, I was like doing my caryatid hunt in London on this same day and like on my phone, like getting updates about his 17-hour stint showdown with the police. And I just love what Bryony says at the bottom here, more grace in the soles of his bleeding feet and so on. But there's something about him on that day made me see him as a liberated caryatid. But again, you can see the way that statues are, the coloniality of statues is being subverted. Now onto Michelangelo. So like back, are we going back and forward? Michelangelo also sort of entered this kind of like tradition of the Atlas slaves. He was like a pope's just died, and so it's kind of interesting to think about that he was commissioned for Pope Julius II's tomb to create these slaves. Again, the Catholic Church being built on like a highly organized program of extraction. Um, this is a sketch Michelangelo made at the turn of the 16th century. Now, the thing is, he turned his back on this whole project in a way. I mean, the tomb of Julius II is amazing for Michelangelo's Moses statue, but the slaves he never he never used them. Instead, what he did is detached them from, as you can see here, they're very much in the vein of like the columns that we've seen as like that is the caryatid or atlas tropes, that they're human figures, but they're columns. But what Michelangelo did was like turn them into sculptures. And there is something so like almost moving and dreamlike about these sculptures. Something so like almost like they're emerging from water, or that they're I don't know. There's just like a dreamlike quality to them, but they're also figures that are in agony. But there's something about them, but that pertains to emancipation. So he left them infinito, like unfinished, but also I guess that means infinite. Um, and then so these are the more kind of like Atlas figures, I guess. And then these are like the idea of like enslaved peoples. Um, so there's four of them that exist. They're currently in Rome. Um, I think he hated this commission for Julius II. And you can see how this influences 19th century, especially Rodin, the fallen caryatid carrying her stone. Again, Rilke, the poet's reception of this sculpture very much pertained to the dreamlike state of it. The idea of having a burden in the dream. But I see it also in the vein of the Michelangelo sculptures. And just to say, they've been removed from their historic role of upholding the entablature. They're now free sculptures, and yet they still pertain to a burden. I don't know where that's going. I'm just like throwing it out there. And you can also see, yeah, again, just thinking about how others have used the caryatids for reactionary and fascist purposes. Theodor Herzl, on his one trip to Palestine, stops off in Athens and takes this very staged picture. So there's obviously, as we know, one of these caryatids is in the British Museum at this point. So there are five caryatids here in Athens. and there are five Zionists here. I don't know what we make of that. It's interesting. Herzl is frequently described as an atlas, and his Zionist newspaper was called Die Welt, which means the world in German. So, the trope of the atlas is carrying the globe. So I think Herzl also joked that he was an atlas in as much as he's got this newspaper Die Welt that he's having to um, carry. But it's interesting to think about this figure of uh, like oppression, agony, and how others have appropriated it, or how the figure might pertain itself to like fascism. Um, I guess nothing is a given, and the interpretive process can yield kind of any permutation. So again, we have this is like a proto-fascist figure in William Blake, Urizen, um, who again pertains to this kind of like agony, this globe. Although Blake doesn't explicitly call this figure an atlas, there's a sense in which um, this burden of the it's almost like incelly, like this burden of the individualist, masculinist figure, authority figure. Um, and yeah, Benjamin Blake also uses the words petrific, so like a version of this petrification that Fanon uses. And I was just reading the Book of Urizen last night. The word eternal is almost in every stanza. It's quite interesting. Um, and then, yeah, I won't have time to read this passage from the Aesthetics of Resistance, but if you do want to read it, just read the first 50 pages because it's a virtuoso historical materialist kind of like Marxist art history of the Pergamon frieze in Berlin, which again are colonial spoils taken to Berlin. Um, what Weiss does in that reading is shows that the figures depicted in the frieze are the figures that of labor that were transporting the stone. So kind of what I wanted to think about in relation to that was this, in the depictions of these laboring figures and these belabored figures, you there's like a doubling because you have like the depiction of labor by labor. So you can even extrapolate that, the curse of the proletariat, the curse of labor is having to depict its own laboring bodies. And Vice shows how, or sort of like speculates how the sculptor, looking at the frieze from a distance, would have seen in his foreground these muscly men and looked at their bodies, and that's what's being depicted in the frieze. So it's labor depicting labor. Did we have a Marx quote somewhere that I've missed? Just at the bottom here, in the course of the labor process, labor passes continually out of a state of unrest. And this is again, Walter Benjamin talks about petrified unrest, um, into a state of being, out of the form of motion, into the form of objectivity, definite masses of crystallized labor time. So again, you can read into that the function of sculpture is to reify labor, to turn a process into an object or a thing. Again, that goes some way to emphasizing how labor is figured as an eternal burden. Da, 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 da. Agnes Varda refutes the Vitruvius myth. I wonder if someone else could read this passage from her film, just because I feel like I'm just chatting too much. Um, would someone else be able to read this? This is a caryatid that, again, she says hardly anyone notices it, but it's there. It's like huge. Um,
Yeah, I don't mind reading.
oh, that would be great. Thank you, Betty.
No worries. Yeah. This rarely noticed strange angel is on Rue Turbigo, facing the Office for Improved Housing and Small Homeowners Aid. Its neighbors seem unaware of this giant caryatid, don't even wonder about it. For them, Turbigo's victory in 1859 gave the street its name. Or is it Or it is an upholsterer's sign due to the sack like a tassel, that the lady with a bag of fortune with myrrh or the odd angel. No one knows who made her nor what she represents. Agnes Varda, Lady Caryatides, 1984.
Thank you. Um, and I love that Vada ends this. I mean, if you watch the whole film, she disputes the Vitruvius myth, and she's sort of like she obviously, as a feminist filmmaker, she thinks about these women, which the Parisian caryatids are very like voluptuous and sexy, and obviously um, this very much like Varda finds this quite funny, and she ends the film just on this to be go caryatid, and she ends it with a kind of like openness, like actually no one knows who she is, what she represents. And so I just think it's interesting to not just take Vitruvius as his word, as also as the inaugurator of like architectural history, but to think about what else is going on in this whole thing. Um, Varda says no one knows who made her or what she represents, and that's the kind of like the most important thing about the film. Um, and then yeah, these caryatids. Um, I took this picture in London in March. These are repositioned caryatids. They were originally from Rotherhithe Town Hall in London, and then they've been relocated to Southwark Park. Somehow I found these figures very moving as well. They're kind of like Art Deco. They've got these amazing, she's got these kind of like amazing bows around her chest. And again, you can see that only one arm out of the potential four, oh, no, two arms out of the potential four. This woman has her arms broken off. And again, thinking about that, these figures are now, even though they might have been part of a bourgeois purpose, they're now kind of like embedded in a different way, facing a different way. And so it made me think about Walter Benjamin from One Way Street, where he says, torso. Only he who can view his own past as an abortion sprung from compulsion and need can use it to full advantage in the present. For what one has lived is at best comparable to a beautiful statue which has had all its limbs knocked off in transit, and now yields nothing but the precious block out of which the image of one's future may be hewn. Um, Beautiful, but I just wanted to think about that in relation to Vada and relation to what's the other life of these these people? They're figures, they're people. Um, we really won't have time to discuss Art Nouveau very much. But again, the whole premise of this talk was like sadism, and Art Nouveau is the other example of sadism in the city. This image is just from the outside of a pub in Dundee. I was in Dundee over the weekend and I just saw it, but you could see it anywhere. But I just chose to give you my most recent sighting of it. This is the whiplash curve. It's like a highly um what's the word? Like recognizable Art Nouveau motif. And then just on the right to see this is my friend Sam is in Vienna at the moment, and he just sent me these. These are Art Nouveau caryatids, just to show the kind of like crossover. Um, and then Betty, who just read, actually sent me these from. It was in Brussels, wasn't it, Betty? The Victor Horta house.
Yeah, that's right. It's the Maison Solvay in Brussels.
And again, you see, I think this is his like masterpiece work. You see the whiplash curve. Um, he was the sculptor of scu- the architect of Leopold II and the Congo Free State, which was the kind of like brutal genocide of Congolese people in the late 19th, early 20th century. Like literally the possibly the worst colonial brutality perpetrated against any human beings. 12 million Congolese people were genocided. Um, and the whiplash curve is not like you can't separate it from what happened in the Congo. The sinuous lines were literally fantasies about um, Congo vegetation, and they were explicitly referencing the whips that were used colonially against the indigenous population, as well as the plant life there in Congo. Um, so something that might seem quite innocuous, the kind of like Art Nouveau curves that we all know. I mean, you can see dozens of these anywhere in any European city. Um, Literally, colonial brutality is what Walter Benjamin says of no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism is so true of this. Um, and then this is some writing that I did for a collection called Vegetal Soul, which is like essays and prose poems, but a lot of it was about Art Nouveau. I'll just quickly read it and then we can have a wee break and then open it up to discussion. It's curious and revealing that so much of what became essential to Art Nouveau was first codified in Belgium during the decade in which the brutal and genocidal colonization of Congo was responsible for the genocide of 10 million Congolese lives. Art Nouveau's Belgian founders, Victor Horta and Henry van der Velde, had intimate links with the King of Belgium and his despotic regime. The wealth allowing for their style flowed directly from the Congo Free State. Art Nouveau is imbricated in this colonial racism from the start. For a time, Belgian Art Nouveau was referred to as Style Congo. So it's literally, Art Nouveau is literally called Congo style, subsequently glossed over in later art history. Deborah L. Silverman's work, aiming to bring Belgian imperialism back to the center of the story, excavates the hitherto overlooked aspects of motifs in Art Nouveau, the reduced elephant and the whiplash curve. Their style was famously captured in Horta's statement that he saw the stalk, not the bud or the flower. Second, that they characterized the Art Nouveau line as mobile and directional, a line of force with the physics of a whip, what was called a coup de fouet or whiplash style. The whiplash style is a ubiquitous signifier of Art Nouveau, its agency shrouded in a milieu of colonial violence, combined with the advancement of an aesthetic vernacular of aestheticism. Silverman writes, the whiplash style provides visual equivalents of two foundational elements of the regime in the Congo Free State, the rugged, relentless, sinuous coils of the Congo's wild rubber vines, hailed as vegetable boas with veins of gold, and the imperial chicotte, the long flogging whip at the center of Leopold's rule. And I won't read the rest of this, but the Congolese philosopher Valentin Yves Mudimbe recently passed away, I think last week. And he also um, thinks about the line, this the boundary line, the colonizers' use of line in um, instituting colonial reality by creating borders, creating like lines, creating states. Um, our physical geography, he writes, the whole domain of our culture, including mental configurations and our relation to nature, our topography is structured by lines. And so, there's nothing innocent about the Art Nouveau line. It's a colonial line. Um, so I'll stop the presentation there, um, running a wee bit over. Um, Shall we have a 5-minute break and then we can have a 20-minute discussion? And if you've got any thoughts or reflections and you don't want to speak in the discussion, feel free to post in the chat uh, or direct message me if you want to remain completely anonymous. So yeah, should we come back at just 10 past then? Great. Oh yeah. Um, was that quite a short break? Do people want a bit longer?
I, it's all right. It's good.
Oh, nice to see faces emerging from the sort of like darkness. Hi everyone. It's quite weird actually, like doing a talk when you just don't know who's like you can't see people's faces, so I'm just like I don't know. Um, but yeah, lovely to see so many faces emerging, and also no pressure to show your face. Um, you can be like the Cambridge caryatid with no face. Um, yeah, do people wanna? Um, I'm quite interested in just hearing from people like about, yeah, have you kind of thought about these figures before? Like, how does it relate to your practices? I know lots of you are like artists or writers or poets or anti-imperialists, and hopefully all of the above. Um, but yeah, just want to open up the space and like if any reflections or any thoughts or questions or yeah. Marsha in the comments said, I had no idea about the connection with Congo with you. I know when I first realized it as well, like my jaw dropped. Because you do think of Art Nouveau, I think, as quite something quite tame about it or just like innocent about it. And I think it does, it's in its representations of babies, that it does play on its own innocence. I mean, again, like Walter Benjamin is such careful reader of these things, and he associates Art Nouveau with a kind of like prepubescent innocence, and yet it it pertains to the kind of most brutal form of imperial and racist domination.
I mean, it's hard to say something because it was really amazing, the lecture. And um, I think I want to thank you. And also I love this idea of sharing knowledge in this format. Um, it's really great. And it just you brought so many different aspects together. And almost every time there was this idea that there's a possibility to see it differently, to have like your own relationship to this sculpture that is really kind of detached from all these really dominant colonial readings, and that I put, like, for example, the statues in the Acropolis. And yeah, and think also about these sculptures, yeah, when they're displaced somewhere, what happens with them? How do we they become so different. And or like in one sculpture, you also said like all the limbs are kind of broken in transit. Are these kind of broken sculptures or the incomplete one from Michelangelo? Sorry, I'm making loads of connections, that you kind of put out there like that. But how they can kind of change and maybe can be used also to resist this imperial connotations. I don't know. Is that possible somehow? And then I have one question for you. Like when you said that a lot of these sculptures are kind of hidden inside, I thought that was really interesting because in a way we're so used to seeing them, but we don't really engage with them actively. Is that actually quite dangerous to not do that? And because they become part of kind of the consciousness of society, and is incredible how they just remain in this world and remain kind of keep this feeling alive of this possibility of this imperialist domination from horrific people. Yeah, what do you think how it becomes part of our bodies? Seeing, I mean, almost hearing them but not listening to them, or I don't know how you translate that with visual, like to see them but not to translate, actually, not to do this process of translation, which is more active. Yeah.
Thank you, Grace. And yeah, really interesting to hear your thoughts as you are a sculptor. Um, yeah, what I mean, your first point was about what do we do with the imperial sculpture that is everywhere in our cities? And I think this is like a totally open question. It's been approached, I think especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter uprisings of 2020, it's like I think the question with the Coulson sculpture in Bristol was what are we supposed to do with this? And in India there are sculpture parks where all the colonial sculptures have been taken to like a theme, like almost like a theme park, and put there. So, and they're allowed to get like overgrown and just root, but it's like you walk through like a graveyard of sculptures of like George V or Queen Victoria or whoever. Um, so there are these kind of like methods of dealing with imperial sculptures. Um, in terms of the hidden in plain sight thing, it's very, very interesting. Like these are expressive pieces of public art, and yet they're totally hidden. That's why I think of them as part of the external unconscious of the city. Um, and yeah, I guess that just says so much about psychoanalysis and art. Um, does anyone else want to come back on Grace's question before we get to Xuanlin's really incredible questions in the chat?
I just wanted to add on the kind of like perspective or them being hidden in plain sight. I was thinking about perspective and how they're also positioned above eye line so that you have to look up to see them. So they're also kind of given this sort of more godly position. They're like out of reach. We can't touch them. And also that they're like probably larger than the human body itself, I would imagine a lot of the time. I don't know how that plays in, but maybe something about power, I guess, makes me think about.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because like walking down a high street, you begin to realize that no one is looking above the ground floor, even to the next floor. Like what's going on just above capitalist realism on the ground floor. You then have like colonial realism on the next floor. Um, but yeah,
Like a reverse archaeology, where instead of going down, you're like going up as you're going back.
that's a really amazing thought, Betty. Yeah, yeah. Um, Whoops, I just muted myself. In the chat, Xuan Lin's formulated two kind of like amazing lines of thought. Um, I hope it's okay for me to read these out. Um, I was wondering about the gender dynamics of the caryatids and also the idea of grief and care as feminized labor. Looking at many of these statues made me so sorrowful. I love that effective response to them. And yeah, I definitely think especially the women, there is this kind of like melancholy that pertains to them. Um, Yeah, I wonder. I mean, what we talked about right at the beginning was how it's interesting that because I gave the example of the Mitchell Library, which has the kind of like classical Greek inspired caryatids at the top, and then the figures of the struggling atlases below, but they're organized by gender. There's a gender binary that plays out with this because you never it's quite clear the way that they're broken up into this binary. Um, I wonder, does anyone else want to respond to this point about grief and care as feminized labor? Interesting, yeah. I think there's also a thing like the Erection Athenian caryatids with their drooping robes, which again are kind of like wet look, like there's a that is the heaviness of them. They they seem to stand with like a weightless grace, and yet their robes give this kind of like weightless, weighted, kind of grieving, mournful heaviness, I think, weight. Um, I feel like their burden is not, with the atlases, the burden is often expressed in the musculature or in the fact that they're leaning forward or in the fact that their faces bear expressions of subjugation. Whereas I think those beguiling Athenian caryatids, their burden is expressed in the robes as well. And again, it's interesting they're not nude. Caryatids very rarely nude. They're not given the space to exist on their own terms as nudes. They're historicized.
I don't know if this is relevant, but I thought maybe it's interesting that because you mentioned in a way that they feel like when there is this marching that they're taking part in the processions. But I don't know if I saw it correctly, but like I think they have different legs going up, not all the same. So there's also this idea of moving differently or moving more unpredictably rather than being in this kind of yeah,
Yeah, that's
fixed.
actually a really fascinating point that they might be in contrapposto, but they're not symmetrical, are they? There's like one woman will be left leg, one woman will be right leg. So yeah, there's this, and it's interesting to look at if you look at those women, the Athenian caryatids, it's interesting to look at the differences, like almost like, one of those games where you have to spot differences. Um, so yeah, that's interesting. Just to go back to Schwanlin's second point as well, the idea of sculpture always about stasis, but do you see the reverse being possible, i.e., used for revolutionary feeling and struggle? Such an interesting question. And I hadn't thought about things like that, but can there be revolutionary sculpture is such an interesting question. I mean, even like thinking about Soviet sculpture, it's like Lenin would have hated all the massive Lenins everywhere. But I mean, it's obviously sad that they came down. But he just would have hated that kind of monumentalization of what it should be a living struggle. Um, so I don't know. I guess the Bauhaus experimented with kinetic sculpture quite a lot. Laszlo Molinaggi. Um, uh, there's kinetic sculpture in Glasgow, but it's counter-revolutionary. Um, glorious face. Um,
You mean the one on the pond in Queen's Park?
no, that one's quite good.
I think that one's quite revolutionary.
There's the one, oh, what's it
It
called?
kind of doesn't work.
Hmm. It's in the Trongate building. Do you know what I mean? It's like a kinetic sculpture, but it's very much like quite conservative. Um, let's see what other comments are in the chat. I've only got 10 more minutes. Um, oh, Nereids in the Neptune fountain in the center of Bologna. I have been to Bologna, but I can't remember them. Um, would you be able to put a picture in the chat by any chance? Also, did you think about Notre Dame being rebuilt? Paul B. Preciado. Interesting, yeah. I haven't read the Preciado text. But yeah, I agree. Notre Dame shouldn't be rebuilt. Also, it was rebuilt like so quickly, which when you consider the fate of the Acropolis or the Sagrada Familia, for example, it's like not on the same temporality. I don't know how the French did it. Um, Moving away from the lionization of individuals. Oh yes, Gaston Canafani was a sculptor um, uh, who made like quite avant-garde, like modernist sculpture. And I think you're right, Xuanlin. I think the like modernist avant-garde sculpture, especially when you think about Canafani as a avant-garde sculptor, it's quite a remarkable thing by itself to consider. But yeah, what he's doing with that sculpture is the one that me and you were looking at together, Schwenden, was like bringing to life the propaganda posters and showing a kind of like revolutionary dynamism within sculpture. So yeah, I think you're right. You know, there is um, revolutionary sculpture is possible. And yeah, thanks, Joey Sharmanka. It's got a whole section of the Sharmanka about how the Russian Revolution was like a world historical mistake. If that's a world historical mistake, hate to think what the Sharmanka person thinks about other things. Oh wow, the Bologna is that the Bologna Nereid um, with with like fountain coming out of the breasts. What do you make of that? There are many of them carrying the figure of one man, Neptune, the god of no less than water. Very interesting. And then, sorry, I'm getting a little bit lost in the chat. There, Monica is saying there's a genre of huge monumental Caucasus country mother sculptures, like they're activated caryatids. Wow, I didn't know about that. I'd love to. Mother of Georgia and Mother of Armenia. Are they? Ah, okay. I think maybe I know the genre you mean. And they have the wet dresses as well. Um, Interesting. Any other final remarks? Or actually, sorry, Rianne, did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was such a good talk. But I just wanted to quickly ask if in your research whether you've noticed like a sort of correspondence between the figures and then what the building was used for. Like, because I was looking at um the like Atlas figures on Argyle Street. They're so oh sorry. Um they're like they are so like striking, and then I like was trying to find out what that building was originally like built for, but I couldn't find it anywhere.
It was the Argyle Street one was a department store.
Oh,
And it was built I'd like to say 1870s off the top of my head. Um, so yeah, these figures were basically um, you know, part of this like the department store was also a new phenomenon. Like I don't know if you've read Zola's Emile Zola's book, The Lady's Paradise, but that sort of like shows how the department store was born in Paris at the same time as Haussmannization, like the redevelopment of Paris, which is very much like the period that we're looking at. So, yeah, I guess it's quite a strange thought that you know, like, would you now have like a massive mall with two racialized, struggling, giant granite figures like guarding the entrance? But I mean, it just shows that these kind of like threshold figures were also guarding the world of colonial spoils and consumer capitalism that the department store would have signified. And then with in regard to like the uses of buildings, yeah, the proletarian ones are often on banks, in Glasgow at least. Um, there's a high density in London of caryatids and atlases in the financial district. So they're very linked to capital. Um, what else? Very rarely on like religious buildings. Um, the Mitchell Library is interesting. I can't remember. Um, does anyone here know what St Andrew's Halls were? I'm looking at you, Joey, through Adrian. Um,
Yeah, I think it was a music and concert venue, but I think vaguely I remember reading something that it was also, yeah, partly for the working class, they needed speaking space, like more for meetings. So there was like a huge like pageant in 1950, like the 33rd anniversary of the Russian Revolution took place there. A lot of revolutionary meetings took place there. So it was a huge music and concert venue, but I think it was explicitly partly as well because there was a need for more like meeting assembly space in the city as well.
interesting. Thanks. Um, are there um, Adrian is saying, are there existing records, indices of caryatids and atlases as specific type of sculpture? Or are you compiling? I'm compiling this for Glasgow. So I'm making a listing of the different caryatids and atlases. And again, one of the interesting things is like every time I'm out, I see a new one. So like I'm on like 43 at the moment, I think. Well, there's this guy called Colin Drysdale who also seems to take pictures of them. So I need to pluck up the courage and just get in touch with Colin. And um, I'm worried he'll think of me as too far out. Um, and yeah, the Paris ones, that would be a huge task because Agnes Varda says that there's like 12 or 14 in Paris, but there's actually like 500. So I don't know where she got that. Um, though I'd love to go there in the future. Actually, just on the point about the Argyle Street caryatids, Rianne, there's Le Corbusier talks about mannequins in the same way as caryatids of department stores. That's just like a random connection. And then Salika is saying um, the caryatids bear being for protection of others, sacrifice, or this state in waiting being feminized too, as well as racialized. Yeah, it's interesting that Walter Benjamin sees them as protective, like threshold figures who guarded over his childhood. Um, so very interesting. Yeah. Bodyguards posted up inside. Oh yeah, that's true. So Xuanlin, you're thinking of them as like cardboard cutouts of policemen that you sometimes see in stores. Hmm. Is that right, Xuanlin? Is that what you're thinking? Um, well, I guess the suited up security in tuxedos, often inside luxury stores. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. That would certainly fit with caryatids. I'm not sure it would fit with atlases. Um, any, I think we should probably wrap up threshold uniformed figures and the class dynamics there as well. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting feature of like bourgeois aesthetics that the bourgeoisie constantly makes the proletariat wear bourgeois clothing. So like you can think of waiters or butlers. Um, it's it's to erase a sense of working class like autonomy. The working class have to dress as in these bourgeois when they're in the same spaces as the bourgeoisie, I mean, like, okay, I think maybe we should wrap up there. But yeah, feel free to like get in touch with me about these musings, and I'll be also sure to like if it's okay with everyone, I might download the chat and then also reach out to people if I write stuff and want to credit people from this discussion for your amazing thoughts, which have already like sparked so much. So yeah. And yeah, I can email the slides to all participants and the recording as well. I actually forgot to stop recording in time for the chat, but I hope people don't mind. I'll stop the recording now.